You think you're freezing just because your breath turns to mist in the morning and your fingers stop obeying you? Step outside without a jacket and you'll feel awful. In the Middle Ages, feeling awful was the default. At night, people didn't survive because of the cold. During the day, because of hunger. There were no jackets, no heating, and definitely no hot shower after a long day. In winter, a peasant's home wasn't a refuge. It was a trial. There were no thermometers, but when children stopped crying, it meant it was already too late. The walls weren't a shield. They were the illusion of one. From the inside, they seemed rough, solid, capable of keeping out anything from evil spirits to the winter wind. But when the temperature dropped so low that the water in a bucket by the door froze solid, even the thickest logs began to groan, and the air seeped through every crack. A draft wasn't just unpleasant. It was a sentence, unless you acted quickly. And there was almost nothing to act with. A peasant house wasn't a fortress, wasn't a cliff. It was a patchwork shelter built from whatever was at hand. A dirt floor, wooden boards, clay. A little straw shoved into the gaps. But winter was stubborn. It always found a way in, like a rat, like fear, like death. Especially at night. When the wind started to howl, it didn't knock. It walked right in. If a gap in the wall hadn't been sealed, if a rag slipped out of place, if a chunk of clay fell out, the warmth vanished in minutes, and with it, the chances of surviving until morning. First, they fought it with straw, stuffed it into cracks, packed it under the roof, laid it along the walls. Then came the manure. Yes, the real stuff. Dried, warm, sticky. They mixed it with clay to plug the biggest holes and stacked it along the walls. It gave off a little heat and blocked gusts of wind. Nothing was thrown away. Everything became part of the shelter because even the tiniest crack could become the space between life and death. Sometimes, frost formed on the inside of the walls. The cold got so bad that even indoors you could see a thin shimmer of ice. That's when they went for the last sacks, covered the walls with rags, cloth, skins. Everything, even the old clothes of the dead, was turned into a shield against the cold. No one was squeamish. If the rag used to be Grandpa's shirt, it was now the barrier between his grandchildren and death. There were days when it felt like the house itself was breathing cold. Inhale. The wind crept in through a corner. Exhale. The warm air vanished into the dark. So, everyone huddled together in a single room, sometimes even in a single corner. Body heat could soften the blow of the freeze, if only a little. But even then, there was no certainty it would be enough. By morning, not everyone might wake up. Even sturdy homes with stone stoves didn't always save them. The stoves cracked from the wild temperature swings. Clay crumbled. The firewood burned too fast. But the true enemy wasn't the cold itself. It was its unpredictability. It didn't attack outright. It crept up. First, your fingers go numb. Then your feet. Then your breath starts to sound different. And if at that moment a new draft opens in the wall, that means the night isn't over, and the odds are slipping away. Those who made it through such nights knew. Total silence never meant safety. The creak of wood, the rustle of a rag, a neighbor's breathing, these meant life still lingered. But if it grew too quiet, if even the wind couldn't be heard, it meant the draft had found a way in after all, and maybe not just one. Sometimes the cold didn't enter like an enemy. It came like a shadow, not screaming, not roaring, but slowly, almost gently. It would lie down beside you, wrap around your legs, breathe into your face. And while you slept, you'd stop being a person and become a body, still, cold, useless. At that point, the walls no longer mattered. That's why peasants didn't really sleep. They dozed, they listened. They took turns getting up to check if everything was still in place. When the walls no longer offered protection, when the fire burned down to its last ember, and only the cold remained. Creeping deep into the bones, peasants stopped relying on buildings, on objects, or on prayers. They relied on the body, their own, someone else's, anyone's. Human warmth became the final currency they could stake against winter. And it didn't matter who slept with whom. What mattered was that someone was there. Everyone shared the same bed. Infants, elders, parents, neighbors. If there was space, it was used. Sometimes they slept in shifts, some lying down, others holding and warming them. Then they'd switch. Physical closeness wasn't intimacy, it was survival. Even awkwardness disappeared, replaced by trembling. Only the dead slept alone. Animals weren't an exception. They were part of the family, not out of affection, but out of necessity. Without them, it was too cold. The goat was kept close to the bed. The pig sheltered under the eaves by the wall. Sheep tucked into corners. Chickens spent the night in baskets near people's feet. Sometimes, a cow would lie right there on the straw. One breath sent steam into the air. One broad flank radiated heat across several feet. This wasn't a barnyard. It was a living, steaming, stinking cloud of wool, breath, and manure. A pig wasn't just meat. It was a heater. If it was still warm, there was hope to hang on. If it had gone cold, winter was starting to win. Peasants brought animals inside not because they wanted to, but because they had no other choice. You couldn't survive without heat, and heat had to be stolen from wherever it could be found. In the mornings, they woke up in sweat and smoke, the vapor from their bodies mixing with soot from the hearth. The stench was unbearable, but no one complained, because worse than the smell was silence. The most vulnerable were the children. They were placed in the center, like the axis of a living circle. Mothers held their infants tight to their chests, wrapped them in whatever they could. Sometimes they slid them between the fabric and their own bare skin, so breath could warm the baby directly. There were nights when adults lay along the outer edges, offering their backs to the cold gaps in the walls so that the fire of breath at the center wouldn't go out. There were even rules. If an animal stopped snoring, check if it's still alive. If a child stopped moving, wake them. If someone in the corner started gasping, lift them, shake them, drag them to the middle. Everything in the room was breathing, not to sleep, but to keep the warmth alive. The air was cramped, heavy, wet, but better that than cold and dead. No romance, just math. Every body was another degree toward life. Even if your back ached, even if someone coughed all night, even if there wasn't enough air to breathe, everyone pressed close, because there could be no empty space between one body and another. Empty space meant draft, and draft meant danger. And so, hundreds of winters passed. People didn't survive because of houses or clothing. They survived with their bodies, crowded, tangled, stinking, shivering. As long as someone in the house was breathing, the house was alive. Nothing else mattered. When someone hears the word winter, they imagine snow, frost, icy window panes, and soft gloves that can be taken off on a warm bus. In the Middle Ages, winter meant something else entirely. It wasn't a landscape, a backdrop, or a season. It was physical pain. It started in the fingers, crept into the joints, settled in the knees, and made a permanent home in the spine. Even if you survived it, winter still lived inside you. First came the heaviness, not the kind that follows a day in the fields, but something deeper, sticky, compressing, internal. Your body felt like it was turning to stone, especially in the early morning, when even moving a single finger took effort. Those who lived in the dampest huts started hobbling like old folks before they were even grown. The cold didn't eat you from the outside. It gnawed from within, especially when you had to get up at night. Legs stiff, back creaking, fingers disobedient. And every winter it came again, another ring of pain added to the body. Frostbite was normal, not rare. People lost feeling first in their fingertips, then in their feet, then in their cheeks and noses. But they didn't always notice right away. One wrong move, and the skin would turn blue, then black, then die. Some peasants literally broke off their own finger joints, thinking the numbness would pass. Others carried wooden chips in their sleeves just to keep their fingers moving. Some pounded on their own arms with fists, just to remind their hands they were still alive. Joint pain was part of winter. It had many names: deep aches, ancient hurt, ice sickness. These weren't diagnoses. They were sentences. A person could survive the cold and still never fully stand up straight again. It started in the knees, spread to the hips, then to the shoulders. Everything became stiff like a rusted machine. Old men didn't carry walking sticks. They simply moved slowly, because that was the only way. Their bodies didn't age from time. They aged from winter. Women suffered even more. Giving birth in winter meant blood loss worsened by the cold. Carrying buckets of water meant swollen, cracked hands. Tending the fire while sitting in damp air led to spinal inflammation. No herbs, no poultices, no medicine. Healing was a matter of endurance. Or it didn't happen at all. And all of it in silence. No one complained, because there was nothing to compare it to. Pain wasn't a sign of illness. It was just part of living. When an old woman said, "The winter has settled in my bones," no one asked what she meant. They all understood. Even the children. By the age of 3, they knew that cold wasn't just unpleasant. It could take your fingers, change the way you walked, twist your spine. Bruises, scrapes, purple nails, frozen lips. All of it was part of growing up, not an exception. Playing in the snow ended not in laughter, but in screams and ice burns. Then came another night, another attempt to stay warm, another morning when your hands refused to move. Some peasants lived to see 40, but looked like they were 70, not from old age, from winters. They didn't die suddenly. They crumbled slowly. One joint, one bone, one vertebra at a time, until their body was no longer a home, and became something winter could take completely. It seems like the hearth is salvation, that as long as it burns, the house is alive. That fire is a friend. But in a peasant's hut, fire was more like a wolf on a chain. It could warm you, or it could kill you. It was a fickle ally, one you had to bargain with every single night, and there was never any guarantee that by morning there'd be anyone left to feel the cold. Good firewood was a luxury few could afford. Most people burned whatever would catch: damp branches, rotten planks, bark, manure, straw. The fire it made wasn't hot so much as toxic. It smoked more than it warmed. In a tiny room with a low ceiling, the smoke didn't rise. It stayed with the people, crawled into their lungs, scorched their eyes, and choked them. If the wood was too wet, you had to stay up half the night coaxing it to burn. If it was too dry, it burned out in an hour, leaving you with no heat and no strength by morning. The stove cracked, moaned, sometimes even exploded. Peasants knew. Too much wood was dangerous. Too little was worse. Heat had to be rationed like poison. You couldn't overheat the stove, the clay might shatter, and if a draft slipped in, a spark might escape not up the chimney, but into the straw ceiling. Then the whole house became a bonfire. There were winters when people didn't freeze. They burned. Fire was labor. You couldn't leave it alone. People woke in the night to feed it, adjust it, stir it. They took turns sleeping near the hearth, embracing the logs like a loved one. Sometimes they lay directly on the floor, just an arm's reach away, ready to lunge at the fire to save the home from darkness. And sometimes they nodded off for a second, only to wake up in smoke. Or not wake up at all. Even when things went well, the warmth only reached a few steps. The farther you were from the hearth, the closer you were to winter. Those who slept nearest stayed warm and stayed alive. Those who slept by the door, in a corner, against a wall, often didn't make it. In winter, where you slept wasn't about comfort. It was about odds. Mothers placed their children near the fire and lay themselves at the edge, on the border between heat and cold, like a living barrier. If there wasn't enough wood, people burned furniture, doors, fences, sometimes even their neighbors' fences. If there was nothing left, they burned books, if they had any, or the frames of icons or wooden crosses, anything that would burn. Faith could wait. Cold could not. Ashes were never thrown away. They were gathered, ground up, and used for insulation. They were packed into cracks, rubbed into the floor, sometimes smeared on frost-bitten skin in desperate attempts to draw out the pain. Ash wasn't waste. It was the last trace of warmth still clinging to the house. When the house grew too cold, when fire no longer helped, when the walls themselves began to breathe frost, it was clothing that was supposed to save you. But in a medieval village, clothing wasn't armor. It was a mask, one that barely hid helplessness. It didn't protect against the cold. It only slowed it down. The phrase warm clothing didn't mean what it means now. There were no fur-lined jackets, no wool socks, no advanced layering systems. There were baggy, heavy, foul-smelling, often damp rags, stitched from whatever had once moved, breathed, or grown. Sheep's wool, if you were lucky. Coarse linen, more likely. Hemp fabric that soaked through fast and held no warmth. And over everything, old hides, cracked and soaked in grease. They stank so badly they could scare off animals. Sometimes even neighbors. People wore everything at once. A shirt, then another, then a rough tunic, then a cloak. Over that, a chunk of sheepskin, tied with a rope. None of it fit close to the body. In fact, it left gaps, perfect for the wind to slip in without knocking. But even that was better than nothing. The goal wasn't to be warm. It was to feel dressed, even if you were still freezing. Footwear. That was its own kind of suffering. Boots were made from leather, sometimes from cloth soaked in resin. Calling them durable would be generous. They soaked through in snow, cracked in frost, slipped on ice. Straw was used instead of socks. It was stuffed inside and changed every few hours, or it would begin to rot right on your feet. By morning, your legs reeked of swamp and pain, but it was the only way to keep them attached to your body. Hats, if you had one. More often, rags wrapped around the head, or an old fur mitten turned into a makeshift hood. And if you had nothing at all, then hair, long, tangled, filthy, but at least it covered your ears a little. Clothes were never fully removed, not at night, not in bed, not even when sick. They weren't washed. There was no time, no water, and no point. You dried them on your body, and if they got soaked, you lay down in them anyway, and your own heat pressed the moisture out. By morning, they'd be stiff like bark, but you still couldn't take them off, because you might not get them back on. Your arm wouldn't fit, your leg wouldn't go in, or the fabric would crumble in your hands. The worst thing you could do was undress, even a little. To change a wrap, to clean yourself, to bandage a wound. The moment your skin touched the air, it hit like a blow. Your pores slammed shut, your muscles seized, your breath caught. Some people never came back from that moment. They undressed, and that was it. Their heart gave out, especially the old, especially the children. Clothes didn't protect. They gave you the illusion of protection, and that illusion had to be guarded with everything you had. Because if a rag tore, if a hide slipped off, if a knot came undone, there would be nothing left between your body and death. On a cold night, sleep was not rest. It was a trial. It didn't come as relief, as comfort. It came slowly, cautiously, always with conditions. No one slept deeply. No one slept without fear. Sleep was like a brief forgetting, wedged between two episodes of anxiety. Doze off, wake up, check the hearth, count the breathing around you, pull a rag over your face, doze again, and repeat until dawn, if you were lucky enough to see it. The house slept in unison. No one had the right to silence of their own. Even if you wanted to, you couldn't drift to a corner, slip away from the group, hide under a blanket. Sleeping alone meant danger. Other bodies had to be near. Other breaths, other ears, ready to hear if you began to mumble, moan, or stop breathing altogether. Sometimes, the worst blow didn't come from the cold, but from the silence. Some slept sitting up, pressed against the wall. Others lay on the floor, right by the hearth, hugging bundles of straw or a bucket of leftover ash. Some didn't sleep at all. They stayed up, tending the fire, unfreezing stiff blankets, pinning loose rags back onto the walls. It wasn't sacrifice. It was duty. Failing to keep watch meant gambling with someone else's life. Children were laid in the center, wrapped in anything that could be found. Sometimes 3 were bundled into a single cloth to keep them from drifting apart during sleep. Sometimes they were tied to a parent, so they'd feel it instantly if one stopped moving. Because children fell asleep too fast, much too fast, and sometimes forever. The stove became the center of sleep, but also a trap. Those closest to the fire were warm, but they were also the first to choke if something went wrong. One misplaced log, one gust of wind, and soot filled the room. Lungs collapsed. And then the sleep didn't end. That's why sleep had to be light. With open eyes, with readiness to rise, to shout, to shake those who had slipped too soon into stillness. There were those who feared sleep. They knew the cold crept in when you stopped moving. It wrapped around your feet, slipped beneath your skin, pulled you downward. Sleep, in those moments, felt sweet. But it was a lie. Many died precisely in that moment. Just as they finally began to feel warm, the body relaxed, breathing slowed, and winter struck the heart. In the corners of huts, they found bodies, curled up, eyes closed, looking almost peaceful. But it wasn't sleep. It was the end. Accepted quietly. They hadn't screamed, hadn't called for help. They had simply frozen, slowly, almost beautifully. Sometimes fear was worse than cold, because you knew, if you slept too deeply, you might never wake. But if you didn't sleep at all, you might not survive the night. In winter, the fences between huts disappeared, not because they were torn down, but because the cold erased boundaries. When frost gripped an entire village in its jaws, staying alone wasn't just dangerous, it was suicidal. Firewood ran out, clothes wore thin, hearths burned low. And then, you had to go to your neighbors, barefoot, in the dark, through the snow, against the wind, just for a single ember. A neighbor's fire, that wasn't a metaphor. It was a literal flicker, carried in cupped hands, inside a shell, wrapped in cloth, or tucked into a cracked clay shard. It was held with held breath, like a newborn. Because if the wind tore away the covering, you'd have to start over. And most of the time, there was no starting over. In winter, a coal was worth more than bread. Without it, your house turned into a coffin. But some couldn't go. The elderly, the crippled, women with infants, so others went instead. Not out of kindness, but out of knowledge. Because next time, they'd be the ones asking. Villages didn't survive by strength, but by dependence. Alone, you didn't stand a chance. Even if you had a stove, firewood, and a goat, one snow-filled day. And you'd become the one knocking, one half-lived dawn, and your flame was what someone else needed to survive. Sometimes they shared more than fire. Wood, by the log. Rags, by the scrap. Food, by the spoonful. Anything that burned, anything that warmed, anything that moved, was given if it could be, or traded, or exchanged for a silent promise about the future. There were no ledgers, no debts, no receipts, only understanding. You give today, they might give tomorrow, or not. But the offer was required. There were other times, too, when neighbors said no, when they were afraid they didn't have enough, when they locked their doors and pretended no one was home. That's when a different cold crept in, the kind made of bitterness, despair, fury. And yes, there were times when fire was paid for with fists, or worse. Because when a child is crying and the last ember has died, a person stops being a person. But more often, they helped. Out of habit, out of fear, out of memory. Because in every hut, there was a story of a hand that brought warmth. And people didn't forget that, even years later. Even if the one who helped was already in the ground, their gesture lasted longer than the fire itself. Some left their homes for good, went to places where it was warmer, where there were more people, where someone kept the fire going around the clock, where you could disappear into a collective body, a shared skin, a shared darkness. And even if there was no space left, even if people were sleeping like stacked firewood in the corners, even if it stank of sweat, urine, and smoke, it was paradise. Because there was light, because there was life. Sometimes morning didn't come with light, but with sound. The crack of firewood, a cough, the snort of livestock, the rustle of straw, a child's cry. All of it meant the night was over, the house was alive, and winter had lost again, if only for now. But there were other mornings. Mornings with no creaking floorboards, no breath in the dark, no motion in the corners. At first, you thought everyone was just sleeping. Then, that they'd overslept. And then came the understanding. This wasn't silence. This was the absence of life. The first to notice it wasn't a person. It was the air. It grew heavy, still, as if the walls had stopped breathing. Even if the stove still glowed faintly, even if embers softly shimmered, the silence had already said it. Something had left, and it could not be brought back. Peasants recognized that silence immediately. It made no sound, but it had weight. It settled on your shoulders like snow, but it didn't melt. They woke one by one, not with relief, not with joy, but with unease. They checked the children, silent, checked the elders, unmoving. Sometimes already cold, sometimes still warm, but no longer breathing. A gentle touch of a hand against a body was enough to know. Stillness, not rest, not sleep, but the kind of stillness no one returns from. What they feared most were the dead children, because they looked just like those still asleep. Only they didn't wake, didn't cry, didn't ask to eat, didn't reach out to be held. And in that silence was something unbearable, as if winter itself had fallen quiet, pleased with its work. No one screamed in the house. There were no outbursts, no wails, no sobbing, only slow steps, a cloth over the face, and a small body carried outside, wrapped in the same fabric it had slept in. The elderly died more often, quietly, without resistance. Winter simply shut them off, like a lamp. Sometimes they were found by the hearth, bundled up, eyes closed. No one noticed, until morning. Sometimes in bed, holding a child. Sometimes on the doorstep, where they had stepped out for a minute to fetch snow or add firewood, and never came back. Those mornings etched themselves into memory forever, even if no one spoke of them, especially then. Because death wasn't something unusual. It was a part of life, part of winter. Not a tragedy, but a result. Still, every time the house grew too quiet, hearts clenched, because not knowing was worse than knowing. And on such days, the silence spread beyond the walls. It slipped into the streets, seeped into neighboring huts. Everyone could feel it. Somewhere, there was one less breath. Somewhere, winter had won. For a peasant, winter wasn't a season. It was a sentence, delivered without trial, without appeal, without end date. As soon as October ended, everything around them began preparing, not for cold, but for battle. Because this wasn't just a fight against the weather. It was a siege, long, draining, merciless. And the ones under siege had no stone walls, no stockpiles, no allies. Just a dirty house, darkened hides, and a weak, fluttering heart. The first frost on the grass was like the first crack in the door. It didn't scare, it reminded. Winter was coming, and you were on its list. Then came the snow, light at first, even beautiful, but beneath it, the earth hardened into stone. Water vanished. Roads vanished. The chance to run to the next village for coals or to trade a chicken for firewood vanished. Each day brought a new layer of isolation. Each night, another step deeper into the cold. But the most terrifying time was pre-winter. Those weeks when you could still act, but couldn't fix what had already gone wrong. If you didn't stock enough wood, you didn't. If you didn't patch the roof, it stayed open. If you had no goat, you were out of luck. Every day became a list of what would run out. Not enough warm shoes, not enough old rags, not enough patience in a sick child, not enough breath in the chest of an old man, not enough nights to outlast them all. Villages had their own calendar, not by dates or holidays, but by the body. When fingers started to crack, it was late November. When the water in the bucket froze even during the day, that was December. When the streets were soundless at dawn, January. When the snow turned gray from ash, tears, and soot, February. And when the first drops slid from rooftops, March. But there was little joy in them, because by then, the tally had begun. How many remained? How many were gone? How many homes never opened their doors again? In winter, there was no pretending. Poverty, illness, loneliness, all of it came to the surface. Some died quietly, in shadow, and no one ever knew. Others burned in the night, and in the morning, everyone saw smoke that shouldn't have been there. Winter revealed everything, laid it bare, without pity, without mercy. But the sentence wasn't only in death, it was in survival too, because if you lived, you paid. A piece of a finger, the hearing in one ear, the rattle in your lungs that would never go away. A stiff neck, crooked hands, eyes scorched by smoke. Winter never let go for free. It left its mark. And each year, you entered it weaker than the one before. That's why peasants didn't rejoice at snow. They didn't play in it, didn't make snowmen. Snow meant labor. It meant the firewood was farther to carry, that feet would freeze faster, that food would spoil quicker, that death was closer. Snow wasn't loved. It was feared. And each year, they waited. Not for celebration, not for warmth, not even for Easter. They waited for the day they could whisper, "We survived." It wasn't said aloud. It wasn't celebrated. It was whispered in the shadows, where the ice still clung. Because winter could return, even in March, even in April. Even spring didn't enter the village with song. It didn't sing, didn't bloom, didn't burst into color. It arrived like a slow leak, first unnoticed, then with smells, with murky water, with mud, with soft, shifting shadows on the walls. And even then, no one smiled, because spring brought not relief, but reckoning. Everything winter had taken was now laid bare, without filters, without snow to hide behind. Yards were exposed. Under the melting snow, they found chicken bones, dead dogs, rotting straw, moldy sacks, forgotten things. Sometimes, bodies. Someone had gone out for firewood and never returned. Someone had laid down by a wall and gone silent. Spring gave back everything winter had hidden, and it did so without feeling, simply placed it on the muddy earth as a reminder. Every dawn has a cost. Huts creaked open slowly. Some never opened at all. People entered homes where no smoke had risen for weeks and found only emptiness. The body might have been removed, but the air was still, like it had been that night. Spring didn't cleanse. It revealed. Mold on the walls. Dead rats under the stoves. Scratch marks on doors where animals had tried to escape. Every crack in the clay. Every drip from the ceiling. All of it said the house had survived winter, but it was no longer a home. People didn't run outside, didn't reach for the sun. They walked through mud, heavy-footed, like the earth refused to let them go. Fingers moved slowly, as if still doubting the frost had truly retreated. Joints cracked with each step. Some stepped out for the first time in months and didn't recognize their village. Too much silence. Too few faces. Too many ashes where windows used to be. Even the water, the long-awaited water, felt hostile. It spread illness. It seeped under doors. It didn't cleanse, it corroded. And if winter brought the fear of cold, spring brought the fear of damp. That's when fevers began. Weakened bodies had no more reserves. Many who had held on through March were gone by April. The fields were still quiet. The earth was heavy, soaked with frozen juices. Seeds didn't sprout, and when they did, not everyone cared. Because while you dug, you remembered who dug beside you last year, and who wasn't here now. And yet, spring came, and it was accepted, not as celebration, not as beginning, but as a pause, a chance, a short breath to gather strength before the next siege. Because everyone knew it would return. Winter never leaves for good. It just steps back. And those who had made it through knew. Joy had nothing to do with spring. Joy was when someone in the house was still breathing, when there were still hands left to grip a shovel, when you didn't have to check each morning to see if the whole house had gone quiet. Joy was when fear receded, just a little, but not completely, because it stayed beneath the skin, deeper each year, quieter, and still, as long as smoke rose above the roof, it meant winter had lost.